Our webinar this morning is entitled Understanding Repetitive Behaviors in Autism. Beck Oakley is our presenter. Beck Oakley is a writer and disability educator who lives in Australia with her 2 teenage sons, both of whom have autism and other special needs. Along with the articles and resources you'll find on her award-winning blog at snagglebox.com, she has written a series of children's storybooks to promote disability awareness for the nonprofit Help a Child Grow Fund, which benefits kids and young people with disabilities. She has presented several webinars for us previously, including Back to School, Preparing Your Child for Family for the New School Year, Learning to Get Help, How to Manage Meltdowns, and Helping Kids with Special Needs to Cope with Winter Holidays. These can be viewed on the Recordings tab of our website at fmptic.org. Thank you, Beck, for sharing your experience and expertise with us today.
Thanks, Chastity, and welcome everybody. Good morning to you. It's evening where I am in Australia, but good morning to you if you're in the US. Hi, my name's Beck. Today we're going to be talking about repetitive behaviours in autism. So welcome if this is your first time attending a Family Matters webinar, and welcome back if you've been to some of our previous ones. As Chastity said, I've been studying and learning about autism for a really long time. I started teaching psychology at university, and I worked in autism research, and then moved on to teaching families and teachers about autism. I myself am autistic, but as are both of my kids. So I'm coming to you from a very personal perspective, but also from having spent the past 25 years learning and teaching about this stuff. So as Chastity said, you can pick up these recordings on the Family Matters website. So we're going to be talking about a lot of stuff today, but don't stress if you've got, if you can't stay for the whole webinar. If you want to watch it again later to take in everything and make sure that you're keeping up with it all, you don't need to stress because you can go and catch it on the website after we're finished. If you have any questions, please type them in. I will get to answering them at the end, just in case I might answer your question as I'm going along. If I don't get to it before we finish, then please feel free to contact me offline as well. I'm really happy to talk with anybody about any issues that they've got or questions they've got, things they want to talk about in more detail. I'll give you my contact details at the end of the webinar. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? Today we are talking about repetitive behaviours in autism. So we'll be looking at what are repetitive behaviours, what do we mean when we use that phrase. You might hear it used a lot. It's one of the hallmarks of autism, and there are many different types, and we're going to be looking at some of them today. We're going to talk about why people do them, what function these types of behaviours have, why are they common in autism, and when do they become a problem, and if they are a problem, what can you do to help? So we're going to look at all of these things today. And the 4 repetitive behaviours that I'm going to focus on today are perseveration, stimming, routines, and echolalia. So those are the 4 probably most common ones. They're the 4 that you're most likely to come across when talking about autism. So that's why we're going to look at those ones today. I'm going to start talking about perseveration because it tends to be the one that I find that people get the most confused about, or perhaps don't understand as well as the others, and it sets a good a base for understanding the other repetitive behaviours. So we'll start and have a look at perseveration. So what is perseveration? What do we mean when we talk about that? At its very basic level, it means to respond in the same way repetitively, but there's a little bit more to that. So it doesn't just mean doing the same behaviour over and over. So it differs from something that you might consider as a habit or just a behaviour that you tend to do over and over again. And there's this added component to perseveration, which is doing the behaviour repetitively past a point where it's reasonable to stop. So what does that bit mean, the reasonable to stop part? Because that's a really important component of perseveration. Where is that reasonable to stop point? How do we know when we start doing a behaviour? How do we know when to stop doing it? So if we look at an example of running, for example, running as a behaviour, so say you're going out for a jog, maybe you're running a race or you're doing a marathon, how do you know when to stop doing that behaviour once you've started? So the way that we know when to stop, where that stopping point is for behaviours, is we have environmental cues around us that we pick up on that help us to know it's time to stop doing that behaviour. So in the example of running, you may get a literal stopping point. If you're in a marathon, there'll be a finish line and that'll tell you when it's time to stop running. Or you might notice that all the other people running around you have stopped running. Other things that you pick up, little clues that you pick up from your environment that tell you it's time to stop doing that behaviour now. The conditions around doing the behaviour might change. So for example, if you're out running and it starts to rain, that behaviour of running now no longer seems like a reasonable thing to do. So that's an indicator to you that maybe it's time to stop doing that behaviour. Or, you know, maybe your shoe falls off or something else happens about the conditions that originally were there for you to do the behaviour have now changed. The behaviour might no longer serve a purpose. So maybe you were out running because you wanted to lose weight and you lose the weight and then you no longer need to well, you would hope that you would continue keeping up that exercise, but maybe you decide you now no longer need to do that because the behaviour doesn't have the same purpose it did when you started doing it. And also, once the stimulus for the behaviour is gone, so the stimulus is the trigger, if you like, the thing that made you start doing the behaviour in the first place. When that thing is gone, that's a signal to us that maybe it's time we can stop doing the behaviour. So say, for example, if you were out running because a giant bear was chasing you and then that bear is gone, it's a signal to you that maybe now you don't need to run anymore and you can stop. So these are all the kinds of things that help us to know where that reasonable stopping point is. So these are the things that are helping us to tell us where that point is of where to stop. So perseveration is responding in the same way again and again and again past that point where there are things that are telling us to stop because the stimulus is gone or the conditions have changed or it's no longer serving a purpose. And perseveration isn't just physical actions too, by the way. It can involve thoughts and words and feelings and more invisible internal kind of activities, not just external things. So some examples of perseveration might be if you keep talking about something after the topic has moved on. Even though you're getting feedback, you're getting some of those environmental cues that maybe it's time to stop talking. So in this picture, for example, this guy clearly looks very bored and he doesn't want to talk about this topic anymore, but this other guy is continuing to talk about it. So that's perseveration because the behaviour is continuing past the point where it would be reasonable to stop. Another example, which I know is a really common one that a lot of parents get, is asking the same question over and over and over even though you get an answer. So ordinarily getting that feedback, getting that answer should make the conditions around that behaviour change, so you shouldn't need to ask the question anymore. So if you continue to ask that question despite getting an answer, that's considered to be perseveration. Experiencing anxiety about an event which is no longer a threat, so if the threat has passed, the example of the bear with the running, that was a good one. So once the bear is gone, if you're still continuing with that behaviour or you're feeling the anxiety, then that's a perseverative behaviour. So these are all conditions around the behaviour that have changed and they should be signalling that the behaviour can stop now. Another example is looking for a toy where it used to hide. So even though you have the information that the toy is no longer there, if you continue to go back and look for it in the place where it used to be, mentally going over and over and over old conversations, which is something we're probably all guilty of. Walking around carrying a towel long after your shower is finished. So I don't mean if you're getting older and you're just getting a little forgetful, but I mean if the trigger of the fact that you are now not in the shower anymore should be triggering you that you don't need to carry that towel around anymore, but continuing to do that for hours and hours later is perseverative. Giving the same answer to a different question. So if somebody says, what's your name? You say, Steve. What's your favorite color? You say, Steve. Where do you live? You say, Steve. So not adjusting your answer to this new stimulus, this new question, and giving the same answer over and over again. Persisting with a solution that's clearly not working. So you might have someone who keeps banging a box on the table trying to get it open, even though it's clear that that banging isn't doing anything and it's not working, but continuing to do it anyway, despite getting that information that this solution isn't working. And one that tends to happen at the start of a new year for some time for some kids is calling the new teacher by their old teacher's name. So even though you have this new stimulus of a new teacher coming in, they're continuing to perseverate with that old behaviour of calling using the old teacher's name. So these are all different types of examples, different situations in which a behaviour is happening repetitively past a point where it probably should have stopped, or definitely should have stopped in some situations. So these are all hallmarks of what we call perseveration. So why do people do this? Perseveration isn't actually a single behaviour. It's often talked about as if it is, but it's actually more a way of thinking and a way of responding and a way of behaving, not a single behaviour on its own. So if we look at all of the reasons why perseveration may happen, it starts to become clear that this is more a pattern of thinking, a pattern of behaving than a single behaviour. So perseveration is quite often a response to being stressed or overloaded and not having access to those parts of the brain that help us to think flexibly and to adjust our behaviour once conditions have changed. It also tends to happen if you don't know where that finish line is. So if you think back to all of those ways that we know when a behaviour is time to finish, if you don't pick up on any of those cues, like you don't notice that all the people around you have stopped running, or you don't visually pick up on the finish line, or you don't notice that the bear is no longer chasing you, if you don't know where that finish line is, it's nothing to tell you to stop doing the behaviour, and so it continues, and that becomes perseveration then. It's also a way of sort of processing experiences, mulling over things and working through things mentally. An extension of that is it's actually a learning style that we use to process information in more detail. So when we need to go over things a bit more and to really parse that information, we tend to perseverate on it. And this is one of the most interesting aspects of it when it comes to talking about perseveration in autism, and that is this neurological inability to shift attention or to inhibit certain responses. And we're going to have a look at this part of it in more detail, because there's a very big difference between wanting to do something over and over again because it calms you down and it feels soothing, and needing to do them over and over again, or having to do them over and over again because you're stuck and you can't move on. You are neurologically enabled to shift your attention onto something else. So let's have a look at that, because that is one of the key components of perseveration in autism. So this idea about cognitive flexibility is actually part of our executive functions, and those are the ones that include things like planning, attention, memory, problem solving, sequencing, all of the things, the activities that require the brain to act a bit like an executive of a big corporation, where they're bringing together information and input from many different parts of the brain to perform an activity. So that's why they're called executive functions, and cognitive flexibility is one of those. And it just means the ability to adjust the way you're thinking to cope with changes. So something in your environment has changed, or your demand level has changed, and your ability to adjust the way you're thinking and behaving to cope with that is called cognitive flexibility. And it involves things like being able to shift your attention, multitask, think laterally, solve problems, think about solutions in lots of different ways. These are all of the hallmarks of cognitive flexibility. Now, people who can't do that or have difficulty doing that are said to be cognitively inflexible, or you may have heard the term rigid thinkers. So that's what a rigid thinker is, someone who has difficulty doing these kinds of tasks. Rigid thinkers have difficulty adapting to new situations because they're not able to do all these things, shift their attention, look at problems in new ways, all of those things we just saw on the previous slide. So they have difficulty adapting to new situations. They have trouble processing new information when the situation changes or environmental cues change. They have trouble taking that in and processing and knowing what to do with it and shifting the way they're thinking and behaving to adapt to it. So it becomes really hard for them to override the old ways of thinking and responding and to start acting in a new way. And that is really the essence of what perseveration is. Now, we had a look earlier at controlling responses as being part of this cognitive flexibility. And these types of responses are called prepotent responses. And what they are, they're another executive function involved in perseveration. And these are the responses that we do over and over and over again so often that they become ingrained and become like an impulse for us. They become habitual. And being able to control those and curb them when we need to, this is one of the ways that we adapt to changes in our environment. So a good example of one of these prepotent responses is the response that we probably all have when you get a notification on your phone. So a text, somebody's liked something on Instagram, and your immediate reaction is probably to reach for your phone when you hear that notification. Now, that's not something we were all born with. That's a prepotent response that has developed over time as we learned that reaching for the phone when we get that trigger is going to be a good experience for us. Sometimes, though, we need to be able to control those impulsive reactions so that we can react in a different way. In this example of the telephone, reaching for your mobile phone, when you're out to dinner or you're having coffee with somebody, you may still feel that impulsive reaction when you hear the text message, but you have to control it so that you don't reach for the phone and you leave that to check your phone for later. So there are situations in which we need to be able, we'll still feel the impulsive reaction, but we need to be able to control it so that we can react differently. This kind of control is really difficult for some people. I really like this picture because it tends to be everywhere you go now, you see that everyone out with their phones constantly. So obviously all of us are experiencing difficulty with this kind of control. But for some people, it's particularly difficult to try and control these prepotent responses. If we can't control these responses, we continue to respond in the same way, even though the environment around us or the context in which the behaviour is happening has changed. So another side effect of this is that doing an activity over and over again that you feel really strongly about increases your emotional attachment to it. So the phone buzzes, you get a text message, it makes you feel good. Then the next time that happens, you feel good even quicker, like that strengthens that connection between the trigger and your response to it. And that makes it even harder then to disengage and take control over your response to want to grab the phone and look at it, because your emotional attachment to that buzzing is getting stronger and stronger. Eventually, you're developing such a strong emotional attachment to it that it just becomes really, really, really difficult to ignore and to control that response to want to pick up the phone. So people who perseverate often also have difficulty with regulating their emotions. So in order to be able to have control over something that you have a very strong emotional attachment to requires a large degree of emotional regulation. And people who perseverate often have a lot of difficulty in that. So perseveration and emotional dysregulation often go hand in hand. And that's something that you often find in autism. Another good example is someone who's, this is actually a common story that I've heard, I've got to say at least a dozen times. So You have a student at school who has an extremely anxious and traumatic reaction to a fire drill. It may have been a planned one, and more often than not it's an unexpected triggering of the fire alarm, and it's a very traumatic experience. And after the experience is over and they've calmed down, the trauma is still there, but they're feeling better about it. But then as they pass something that reminds them of it, so quite often it's a fire extinguisher or it might be the fire alarm box or something, they pass it in the hallway and it triggers off again, of course, all the memories about the traumatic experience, and they feel anxious again. And so what they do is they'll ask, when is the next fire drill, or something along those lines that makes them feel better. Some information that they want to get that's going to help them alleviate their stress about when this is going to happen again. So when is the next fire drill? And you tell them, oh, it won't be till next Friday. And so that calms them down and they feel happy, and that for momentarily that bit of information has reduced their anxiety. But then what happens is next time they see that fire extinguisher again, it triggers the same anxiety again and they feel it all over again. So then they ask again, when is the next fire drill? And you tell them again, next Friday. And this goes on and starts to build into a cycle, and not only every time do they pass the fire extinguisher, but every time they think about the fire alarm or every time they develop some anxiety about their fire alarm, they need to ask that same question again. So you get trapped in this cycle of asking over and over again, when is the next fire drill? Next Friday. When is the next fire drill? Next Friday. And the answer no longer seems to be providing any comfort, and yet they still continue to ask. So that's a really good example of perseveration. And if you look at this, why is this kind of repeated questioning happening? And it could be one of any of these answers or none of them, or it could be a combination. But some of the reasons why it might be happening is that the repetitive and predictable response of asking the question and getting the same response is in itself calming and reassuring. It might be giving him time to process the information that you're giving him and how he feels about it. People with autism quite often need extra time to process not just auditory information but all types of information, to synthesize it and make connections between it and to think about how they're feeling about it. And these kinds of repeated questioning can buy the time that they need to do that processing. It could very well be that he's having trouble suppressing that urge to ask the question. So if we look back to what we just learned about the prepotent response control, if you're having trouble controlling those urges, then every time he feels like he wants to ask the question to get the reassurance, then it's, even though he can sense that you're getting annoyed with him asking, or he knows he shouldn't ask, or he knows he's already gotten the answer, he can't control his urge to want to ask you the question. And likewise, he may not be able to stop himself once he starts to ask. So these are all activities that require a really high degree of self-control that he may not have developed yet. He may lack the cognitive flexibility to stop him from adjusting that response based on the feedback. So again, even though he knows that you've given him the information, or that you're getting very angry, or that you may have even told him to stop asking, none of that is sufficient to help him be able to adjust his response to asking the question. And then, as we saw with how connected we get to things that make us feel good, like with the text messages, the more he asks, the more emotionally involved he's getting, and that's just making it altogether too hard for him to switch his attention onto something else. So these are all the kinds of reasons why perseveration may happen. If you see, a good way of thinking about perseveration is that it's like being on a train that's stuck on a fixed track, and it's really difficult to move that train from one track to the other. You need some kind of bridge or interchange or something, but left to its own devices, that train is just going to stay on that track and keep going. Even though you may want to get off and you may want to go in a different direction, that is where that train is going. It is on that track. It is very difficult to change tracks. And that's how I like to think about perseveration. Sometimes that track goes round and round, so it's not always a straight line track. You may just go round and round and round in circles. Either way, it's really hard to get to any other place, any other destination. Once you're stuck in a perseverative loop or a perseverative train of thought, it's really difficult to get anywhere else. So this is why perseveration happens, but why is it common in autism? If we look back to some of those reasons for perseveration, it starts to become easy to see why it's common in autism, because a lot of these things relate directly to the specific areas of difficulty that autistic people have. So it happens in a response to stress or being overloaded. Autistic people are way more likely to be in situations in which they feel stressed or overloaded, or to not have adequate escape mechanisms to get out of those kinds of situations. So whether it be communication difficulties that are stopping them from letting someone know that they're getting stressed or overloaded, or just being placed in situations where people aren't aware that they're stressed or overloaded, they experience a much higher degree of stress and overload than other people do. As we saw, like trying to pick up on the cues of where the finish line is, it's very easy for people with autism to miss some of those cues. Quite often those cues might be social in nature. It's really easy for them to not pick up on those things. Autistic brains are quite often very hardwired to process things in detail and to focus in a hyper-focused kind of way, which makes perseveration really easy. And this neurological inability to shift attention, those difficulties with executive functions, those tend to be wide-ranging in autism. Most autistic people have difficulty with at least several, if not many, of the different types of executive functions. So it's not surprising then that perseveration is something that's really common in autism. But is it a problem? Is perseveration bad? It's an interesting question, because most often the word perseveration is used to talk about a dysfunctional behaviour, a behaviour that is not appropriate or that is harmful in some way. But this reasonable stopping point that is used to define whether perseveration is happening is, if you think about it, a really subjective thing. It's quite often poorly defined. So as an example, if you have somebody who's going on and on and on and telling you about the weekend football game, how long can you talk about a topic before it gets boring? Where is that defined, and is that different in different situations, and is it different if you are a sports lover or not? Are some topics more dysfunctional than other topics? So is it perseverating if somebody's talking on and on about football, just as likely to be if someone's talking on and on about ancient Roman aqueducts? We tend to sort of think the aqueducts thing is a little stranger and more unusual and less likely to be a topic that other people are interested in, so that tends to be called dysfunctional, when really in essence it's still the same behaviour that's happening with somebody that's talking about sports. So it's an interesting question about whether perseveration is bad and when it is bad, and how do we define when it becomes dysfunctional. It's not something that's only found in autism, it's also found in other things like Fragile X and Alzheimer's, brain injury, ADD, ADHD, those kinds of conditions. So it's not something that's unique to autism. In actual fact, everyone perseverates sometimes. It's just that when everyone does it, we tend to give it different names, like ruminating or worrying, diligence, even tenacity. So people who keep going on and on at something past the point when other people would have given up, or past the point when it's become very difficult, for example, we often call that positive and admirable. So all of those things are also perseverative, but they tend to be considered less dysfunctional. So it's difficult sometimes to know whether perseveration is actually a dysfunctional behaviour or not. And in many ways, perseveration is a helpful way of thinking and behaving. It can help you work through your thoughts to gain a greater understanding about something. It can help you categorize your ideas and experiences to help you make sense of them and make connections, so you can find those memories later and put together ideas to make learning easier. It helps us to process intense emotions and trauma. We develop expertise that way. It's very difficult to become an expert in anything if you don't perseverate on it. It actually helps us turn short-term memories into long-term ones, which is a very interesting side effect, if you like, of perseveration. It helps you to keep going until you find a solution. It's that idea about tenacity. And it helps you to look at all the different angles and possibilities. It makes you a better problem solver. So it can be a wonderful tool for learning. But perseveration becomes a problem when the behaviour isn't productive. So we were talking then about really good, healthy, productive behaviours associated with perseveration. But you can also perseverate on behaviours that aren't productive and that are dangerous and unhealthy. And quite often getting stuck on these kinds of behaviours can stop you from reaching a goal or doing productive things. So those are the times when perseveration becomes a problem. So for example, you can't make a decision because you're spending so long thinking about all the different options that you never get around to actually making the step of deciding. You take too long thinking about the options that maybe some of them are no longer available anymore. You can't learn because your mind's stuck on one topic, or it's getting in the way of you communicating. It's hampering your social connections because you're talking on and on about a topic that nobody cares about, and you're becoming very annoying and people are getting fed up with you. Or it keeps you from experiencing positive emotions because you're always ruminating about negative ones. It stops you being active or eating a wide range of foods or being healthy. If you can't stop doing the behaviour even though you want to, then that's when perseveration is starting to become dysfunctional. It stops you from adjusting to new situations, so you're becoming very closeted or you're finding it difficult to move on. And really, one of the hallmarks of when perseveration has become dysfunctional is how it feels to the person who's perseverating. So as somebody who perseverates easily and often, I can tell you it feels incredibly frustrating to be stuck on a track going somewhere you don't want to go and not being able to move yourself off that path easily into another one. It's a very frustrating feeling. So those kinds of times that you would say that perseveration is a dysfunctional and negative thing. So perseveration in itself is neither good nor bad. It's the outcome for that person in that situation which decides if it's a problem. And that's a really key thing to understand, because it means that no two people experience perseveration in the same way, and even the single person doesn't experience perseveration in the same light in every situation. So given that there are times when perseveration does become a problem, how can you help at those times? So these are some of the things that you can do if you know somebody or you have a child who's perseverating and you need to help them make it less dysfunctional, less of a problem. One of the key things to do is to talk about it. So kids grow up learning how their body works, but people who are prone to perseverate don't often get to learn about that way of thinking and behaving until they become much older. And it's such a shame that people have to go so far into their lives not understanding this very fundamental thing about the way their brain works. It's a very helpful thing for people to understand this about the way their brain works. So if you can take all of this stuff that you're learning today about repetitive behaviours and translate that for your kids and help them to understand the way their brains work, when it's a positive thing and how to recognise when it's something they might need help with, then that's setting them up for a really good chance at being able to help themselves control these things and put in place positive support mechanisms for themselves as they get older. Assessing the problem. So is it actually a problem? Who is it a problem for? And is it always a problem? It's only sometimes a problem. So as we saw, it's not a clear-cut issue about whether perseveration is a problem or not. So you do need to assess whether or not this is something that you need to do anything about. Looking for the cause. So we saw lots of reasons why it might be happening. So you need to step back and look at what purpose the perseveration might be serving before you can start to do anything about it. This stopping point. we need to define where it is. So we often assume that people know where that reasonable stopping point is, but it's not true. And this is especially happens with perfectionists. So one of the reasons for perfectionism is that people who are not perfectionists seem to instinctively know where to stop doing something. So there's a point at which it's that we usually call like good enough. So most people stop when something is good enough. Perfectionists don't really know where that line is, and so they keep going until it's absolutely perfect because they don't understand this concept of good enough. And this is a similar idea. So if we don't specify for people where that reasonable stopping point for a behaviour is, then it's difficult for them to know that they're supposed to stop doing it. Developing self-awareness is really important. It's probably one of the most important tools we have for developing self-control over these prepotent responses. And if you help kids learn about the way their brains and minds are working when it comes to these repetitive behaviours, then this is going to help them develop that self-awareness so that they can help identify for themselves when they're getting stuck and whether it's a problem and what they can do about it. Quite often people recommend putting limits on repetitive behaviour, so only letting people do it for X amount of time in these situations. But with perseveration, that's a really difficult, dangerous path to go down because self-control takes a long time to develop, and most kids have not developed that ability to control their perseverative behaviour for a really long time. And so even though they may want to be able to comply with your request for them to stop doing it, they may literally be unable to do it. And so you may be putting conditions on them that they may just be absolutely impossible for them to fulfill no matter how much they want to. So even though you may be losing your mind because they've asked you a question 7,000 times, just be mindful of the fact that they may literally be unable to stop asking you that question. Developing thinking strategies to help promote flexible thinking is a really good idea. So, and also turning thoughts into something physical that they can do something with externally that helps them to move on. So one of the things that I find really helpful is for kids to draw or write down the thing that they're getting stuck on and then screwing up the piece of paper and tossing it in the bin or doing something with it. So it just helps give that little external translation of the thing that they're getting stuck on and helping them physically move on. Distractions are always good, so adding in another stimulus sometimes can prompt that attention shift, so it's sort of like helping that train to shift the track that it's on, so like changing topic or moving to another room or eating a different food, so something that kind of can sometimes bump the attention shift. Avoiding the triggers, so trying to prevent starting the behaviour in the first place if you know that there's behaviours that perseverate. And exaggerating these environmental cues. So remember how we talked about it's quite easy for these kids to miss the things that are telling them it's time for the behaviour to stop. So if you can make those changes really obvious and give them reminders that the environment around them has changed, then that can help them know, oh, okay, it's time for me to stop doing this behaviour. So for example, that example we had where they're using the old teacher's name at the start of the year. So you might point to the new teacher's name every time you say good morning so that they remember, oh yeah, that's right, it's good morning this teacher, not the old teacher. So these are just some ways that you can help, and I'm rushing through these things quite quickly because we could do a whole webinar on each of these, but we've only got an hour today. So, but if you'd like to learn more about any of these things or talk more about these things, please contact me after the webinar. But the key takeaway about perseveration in all of this is that it's not always going to be voluntary or controllable, and it's not about being stubborn or non-compliant or not wanting to do the thing that you're asking them to do or to stop doing the behaviour, because their ability to control it isn't going to be an indicator of how hard they're trying or how much they want to. It can be a literal neurological inability for them to stop doing it. So the solution is never going to be as easy as just saying don't do that. And that's, if you take away nothing else, then that's a really key thing to remember. Okay, so that's a look at perseveration. Let's now have a look at stimming and see how this as a repetitive behaviour is different to perseveration. So stimming, what is stimming? Stimming is gets its name from being short for self-stimulation, and it is exactly what it sounds like, which is a repetitive activity that you do over and over to give additional sensory or neurological input. There's lots of different reasons for doing it, and there are lots of different ways to stim. So even though this is a very simple explanation, it really does cover a huge range of behaviours. Some examples of stimming, and stimming tends to cover all of the senses, so you'll get different ways to stim that give input with all the different types of sense. Touching bumpy things, rubbing surfaces, doodling is another example of stimming, liking to look at flashing lights or strobing lights or interesting lights or coloured lights. Vocalizing, repeating things over and over, making interesting sounds or grunting, smelling, sniffing things or people or items, jumping, hopping, bouncing, doing those large gross motor movements, twisting body parts, so twisting feet and hands and fingers. Flapping, of course, is a very common, probably one of the most stereotypical types of stimming. These are all examples of different types of stimming, but there are literally, I would say, thousands. So if we look at the difference between perseveration and stimming, where we said that perseveration was like being stuck on a track and unable to switch tracks, stimming then, using this train analogy, would be like being on the train and wanting to open the window so you get the strong wind on your face and the calming sounds and the vibrations and lots of sensory input. So it's less about a way of thinking. If perseveration was the behavior was being repeated because you can't stop or you don't know when to stop or how to stop. But stimming is a repetitive behavior because you want that reliable source of sensory input. So they're really coming from vastly different places. Stimming is a really individual thing. People have very personal or unique stims. There's no one way to stim, and it's not something that people have one across the board way to stim. And it's not just restricted to physical activities. Again, you can stim on thoughts and memories and feelings. It's just people don't tend to talk about that type of stimming very often, but that is also a way to stim. So why do people do it? Stimming can help with lots of different things. It's a way to regulate sensory input, so either under or over sensory processing. So you can either add extra input or you can block out overload. So it'll happen in both situations and it works with both. It's a way of stress release. So quite often pent up emotional energy, so that might be both positive and negative emotional energy, so anger or happiness or excitement. It's a way of releasing these the energy that's created by these intense experiences. It helps massively with thought processing. So these kind of repetition, physical repetition activities allow the brain to concentrate and focus on other things. So if you were able to see me on webcam right now, you would see that I have a little foam football that I squeeze endlessly while I'm doing things like webinars. Verbal communication and talking is far from being my preferred method of communication. I find it very difficult. It's something I have to concentrate very hard on. And so I stim constantly while I'm talking because it helps my brain do something very complicated. And it's interesting to me because just as I swapped my concentration just then to stop stimming with the squeezing the football and to think about what I was doing, it slowed down my language, and I found it much more difficult to do both things at once. Interesting. Anyway, it was a good example of exactly what I was trying to say. Stimming helps you concentrate. Stimming can also be a good thought blocking activity. So if you have an overactive mind or again you're you're tending to perseverate, it can be something that can help calm that and distract you from perseverating. It's a very good way to emotionally regulate. So again, autistic people often have difficulty identifying the way they're feeling, so a lot of feelings feel vague, and if they're experiencing these vague or negative feelings, then it can be a way to balance that by adding predictable, fun feelings that come with stimming. It's a form of entertainment, it's fun to do, it's easy to access, and it's usually cheap and easy to do. It can often be about pain regulation, so many activities with stimming release endorphins, which can help to mask or counter other forms of pain that someone is experiencing. And some stimming actually causes pain. That's like a whole other issue about self-harm, which we could do a whole webinar on. I'm not going to touch on today, but I have a lot more articles about that on my website, which I'll show you in a minute. Stimming is also a form of self-expression, so just like you might smile in response to something that's funny or grimace when you're confused, stimming is a natural response for many people, and it's a way to express how they're feeling. It's a way to connect with the world, so some people who stim use the movement and the input that their senses are getting to interact with their environment, and likewise to connect with themselves. So this is something that is also true for me. I quite often feel like I am floating in space. It's a very difficult thing for me to try and explain, but I don't feel terribly connected to my body. So many of the times when I stim, it's a way for me to give sensory input and connect back with my body and give myself some biofeedback about where my body is in space, if that makes sense. Again, I could talk about that for about 3 hours. Okay, why is stimming common in autism? It's not just an autistic thing. Everybody stims. You could probably think of a dozen different stims right now that you yourself do, like clicking a pen or bouncing your knees or twirling your hair or something like that. Everybody. With autism does tend to have a different, more intense quality. It tends to be a much more intensely felt urge, and it often involves movements that other people consider to be odd. There can be more need to regulate senses. And again, autistic people are more likely to be in overloading situations and need this kind of release, or more of a need to connect with their body or the environment. And many people consider it to be an integral, very positive part of being autistic. They really enjoy it. A good example of the difference between autistic stimming and just regular stimming is that most people would find this repeating GIF of flowing water to be very calming, but only some would feel a very intense relief from watching something like this, or would then watch it for 3 hours straight over and over again. So once you sort of jump up to another level of what this kind of visual stim does for somebody. And then again, only very few people would curate a whole Tumblr or Pinterest board of similar images so that they could then find them when they need them. And I think this aspect of needing to stim is something that's quite unique to autism. There's definitely a qualitative difference in that idea that of the difference between just enjoying stimming and really needing to stim. And I know plenty of people who have curated entire Tumblr and Pinterest boards of similar images, particularly ones of people frosting cakes, which are really exciting and delicious to watch. Okay, so is stimming a problem? Is it good or bad? It's really, I think this is kind of the wrong question to ask, is stimming good or bad? It's just like eating. It's a normal, natural, biological urge that some people feel that under some circumstances can be unhealthy for us. So a better way to talk about it instead of good or bad is safe or unsafe or healthy and unhealthy. So just like how you have some healthy foods and some unhealthy foods, I don't really know what's going on with that picture of the milk. He's looking a little creepy and excited. But anyway, so some foods are safe and some are unsafe, and just like stimming, it's the same thing. There's some stims are safe and some are unsafe. Some are good for us and some are bad for us. So stimming can improve focus, it can help to block out distractions, and it should always be allowed unless it's causing a problem. Now if it is causing a problem, instead of trying to stop the stim, it's better to redirect to a safer or more appropriate stim, or to understand why somebody is feeling the urge to stim. It's very important thing to understand about stimming is that suppressing the urge to stim is really incredibly difficult, and for some people uncomfortable and even painful. It's not a simple thing to do, just like how we saw with perseveration, how it was very difficult for some people to stop, if not impossible. Suppressing the urge to stim is similar. Trying to do it can really elevate stress, and it can increase meltdowns, and it can make problem behaviours even worse. So to give you an idea of what it feels like to try and suppress a stim, imagine being asked not to smile at something that you find really funny. You've probably experienced that. You might have been in church or somewhere else where it was inappropriate to laugh, and you had to suppress a smile, and it's really difficult to do. Or this is an even harder one. If you had to stand with your arms down by your side as a ball flies towards you, you can start to get an idea of how difficult it is to try and stop doing something that your body feels like it has an urge to do. Or just stop hearing an earworm. I quite often use that example when I hear people asking someone to just stop stimming or to stop perseverating. I say, well, just stop hearing that earworm. It's just not something that you necessarily are able to have control over. It's very difficult. Okay, so controlling impulses, our ability to do that, is one of these executive functions, and it's very demanding and tiring for the brain to do. These are tricky things that require everything the brain has got to do. So trying to do them for prolonged periods of time and lots of executive functions at once are really exhausting. They take mental energy away from other things. So stimming, so if you think about it, if you're trying to control the urge to stim, it's taking up all the mental energy that you've got to try and do that. It really doesn't leave you anything left over for anything else, like learning or paying attention. So if stimming, being able to engage in that urge, frees up all those energy, all those resources, and now allows you to be able to use your executive functions. So if stimming is a problem, and I say if, how can you help? So there's no need to stop someone from stimming unless it's a problem for them or someone else. It's not a good enough reason to stop someone from stimming just because it looks weird or it seems a bit odd or something like that. That's not a good enough reason. It needs to be causing a problem. So it needs to be physically harmful for the person or for somebody else, distracting in class, it's stopping them from learning, it's impeding their health or their development, it's doing something that's unhealthy or harmful. And when it is unhealthy or harmful, then what you need to do is try and figure out why it's happening. Is it a way of communicating? And if so, then you can reduce their sensory input, find where the source of stress is, change their environment, reduce their demands. All of these things will help reduce the reason why they needed to stim in the first place. If they're doing it as a way to get sensory input, you can find less disruptive ways to get that same input. It might be entertainment, in which case you can schedule in a bit of stimming time, or you can swap to a healthier stim. And it might be being used to counter other types of pain, in which case you need to have a look into medical causes for that kind of thing. There's lots more information about stimming on my website, snagglebox.com. If you go there and you have a look under the article section, you'll find lots of different aspects of stimming, like how do you teach kids about it, and self-harm, and how to do appropriate stimming at work and school, these kinds of things. So go there and you'll find loads more information about stimming. Right, let's have a look at routines. What are routines about as a repetitive behaviour? What in autism, what are we talking about when we talk about routines? So change can be super stressful for autistic people, and that's because, as we saw, the ability to adjust to change leans heavily on these executive functions, which are all tend to be disrupted in autism, and change often comes with a lot of extra sensory input, which can be difficult to deal with. There are a bunch of new environmental cues, and all of this can be very overloading and stressful. Routines help to mitigate that. They help to reduce all of this stress that change can bring by producing predictable, reliable, consistent experiences. They act like signposts that emits chaos, if you like. So change is like chaos, where you don't know what to expect. You've got all this new stuff coming in you've got to try and adjust to. And routines are these predictable signposts that help you get where you need to go. And they bring comfort by things being done either in the same way or in the same order or at the same time. So these are those three aspects of the ways in which routines can help bring this kind of comfort. So as we looked, and perseveration was about repeating behaviours because you don't know how to stop or where to stop, and stimming was repeating behaviours because it was giving a reliable source of sensory input. Then routines are, in our train analogy, would be like catching the same train at the same time every day, because you know where it's going to go and there are no surprises. It's predictable, it's reliable, and you want to do that behaviour over and over again because you know exactly what you're going to get. Are routines a problem? Most of the time routines are very useful. We use them every day for structuring our lives and making sure we get done what we need to get done. But as we saw with the other repetitive behaviours, routines can be a problem when they become unproductive. So they're putting structure around things that don't need structure, or they're preventing you from doing more productive things. They're interfering with important activities like learning or sleeping. They're stopping you from adjusting to a new situation. There's an extreme reaction to not following the routine. So a lot of you probably understand exactly what I mean by that. So there's a small variation to the deviation, from the routine, and there's a massive meltdown. So the reaction to not being able to follow the routine is out of scope from what the change is. And then one of the big problems around routines is that nobody else is aware that there's even a routine there. So quite often routines can be something you're not even aware of. They can be happening internally, and communication difficulties have made it hard for your child to explain to you that they even have this routine, and routines might form around something you weren't even aware of. So a good example of this is you may inadvertently be putting stuff out on the table for breakfast in the same order every day, and then followed by saying something in the same way. And this may be second nature to you and you're not even aware that you're doing it, but to your autistic child, they may have picked up on that routine and may be using it as a signal to them that it's time to come and eat. And then one day, if you do something slightly out of order, or you use the red ball instead of the blue ball, or you say something slightly differently, that cue is now missing and that routine has now been broken, and so they don't know that it's time to eat, or they don't feel enough comfort that things are going to happen the way that they need them to happen, and it immediately causes stress, and it's a change that they find difficult to process. And the problem there is that they react then to all of that stress by freaking out. You weren't aware that there was even a routine in place, and so you're left completely baffled about why this meltdown is happening. And this can be one of the times when routines really do cause a big problem. So how can you help if this kind of situation is happening? It helps if you can remember that routines are almost always a response to wanting to put structure in place where it feels chaotic. So given that, if you can identify where these sources of stress or uncertainty are coming from, why do things feel so chaotic? If you can help there and to add structure in other places so that there feels like there's less need for that control, then that will help reduce the need to have these routines in place. And again, adding supports and structure, and looking for signs that there may be routines. So these signs might be things like very sudden anxious reactions to a change that doesn't seem to be in line. The scope seems to be way out of proportion with the change that has happened. This might be a sign that there may be an internal routine in place that you weren't aware of. Externalizing the routine is really helpful. So if you have someone who, for example, likes to count, counting is quite a common routine. So if somebody likes to or has to count by threes up to a certain number before they can move from their desk and do another activity, if you can write out those numbers on a piece of paper and cross them off as you go instead of having all that happen inside in the head, that helps you to see where they're up to in the routine. You can get more clues about what's happening when they're using the routine, and you can help them work through it, and it's not all happening inside where you can't see it, and you move it outside where you can do something and help. Practicing change is a really good thing to do, and it's not something that people often think about doing, but kids don't often get a chance to experience change in a positive way. I'm talking about these kids who feel a lot of anxiety around change. So the way to do it in a positive, fun, low-key, relaxed way is to use changing from one preferred activity to another preferred activity. So maybe you go from the trampoline into on the computer, and then the next day you do it the other way and you go from the computer to the trampoline. Both of these are low stress changes because they're both preferred activities, but you can, by doing this, you're helping to build in flexibility into their routines, and you're helping them to experience that change can be okay and going off routine can be okay. And these are important things to help them build up on these positive experiences of change. Okay, and lastly, we're going to have a very quick look at echolalia, which is another repetitive behaviour, this time involving speech. So echolalia is literally parroting back, repeating back chunks of speech, words or whole phrases or whole movie scripts or whole songs or parts of an ad. It's actually part of typical speech development. All kids do it at some point. It's just that people who are echolalic tend to do it later and for longer. It can be both immediate or delayed. So immediate echolalia is when you say something and it's immediately repeated back to you, or delayed echolalia is repeating something back that you may have heard a long time ago. Why do people do this past the point of typical speech development? So it's quite often a filling in the gaps thing, a practicing conversation. So kids learn that there's a back and forth rhythm to conversation, but they're not quite sure what it's about or what they're supposed to say, and sometimes echolalia can help fill in the gaps and give them something to say. It's very often an elaborate label for an object. So when kids learning nouns and learning how to label things, they learn that this sound that you're making, this word, goes with that object and becomes the label for that object. But kids who become echolalic sometimes have difficulty understanding which was the important part of the sound to go with the label. So, for example, if you say, do you want to drink? And the key part of that, the label part of that, is drink. But kids who become echolalic aren't good yet at figuring that important part out, and so they hear the whole thing, do you want to drink? And that becomes the label for drink, so that when they then want to drink, they come and say to you, do you want to drink? Because to them that whole bit has become the label, and that's quite often what echolalia is about. It's a repetitive behaviour, so it's also used like the other repetitive behaviours to calm down. It's a form of stimming because it's a verbal thing that you do with your mouth that feels good, gives sensory input, and it's also in itself a routine. So it flows into these other repetitive behaviours and is also an example of each of them. It's a way to, again, have a bit of buffering time to process thoughts and sounds and experiences and instructions. We all actually quite often do that by repeating things in our heads. Echolalia is sometimes just that coming out loud instead of happening in the head. So that's maybe sometimes why it sounds like it's repeated, but it's really just processing that's happening out loud. And a really important function of echolalia that a lot of people seem to miss is that it's a form of communication. So some experiences are just too intense to try to express or too complex, especially for kids who are struggling with language. They don't have the words, or they may not identify how they're feeling, or may not have a word for it, or the word that you've given to the feeling doesn't really reflect how they're feeling about it. So it's just becomes all too complex for them to try and express it in the words that they already have. So they may use an experience that's similar to something they've already seen or heard, and use that script to express I'm feeling how I was feeling when I watched this bit of the video, or I'm feeling how this character was feeling in that bit of the video. Or something along those lines. So a good example is there's a bit in Finding Nemo when Nemo's dad says, "Nemo, watch out." And it's very clear, and it's exaggerated responses, and it's very evident that they're feeling scared in that moment. And so kids might use that then later when they're feeling scared. So instead of saying "I'm scared" or "help me" or something like that, the best way they've got to express how they're feeling is to say, "Nemo, watch out." And that's a very common sort of form of echolalia. So we go back to our train examples, and we had perseveration, which was being stuck on the track and repeating again and again because you don't know how to stop. Stimming was repeating again and again to get some sensory input that's reliable and consistent. And routines was repeating again and again so that you can predict the outcome and have comfort that it's going to be the same. So echolalia is repeating again and again. In the train example, it would be repeating all the stop names over and over again, parroting the stop announcements or the train conductor announcement, or maybe scripting a Thomas the Tank Engine episode. And it's done because it's about expressive language and communication. That's why the behavior is repeated, because it's the language is being processed or it's being used to express something. So you can start to see how each of these 4 repetitive behaviors, although they have the nature of being repetitive in common, they're really all quite different and coming from very different places. So with echolalia, the idea in helping here is not to fix it or eliminate it or control it, definitely not to consider it mindless or meaningless repetition, but to see it as an opportunity to connect and communicate. It's very easy to tune out when you've heard the same thing said over and over and over again, but every time that a phrase is said, it's an attempt to communicate. So ignoring it is missing opportunities to use to build this bridge. Understanding why it's happening will help you understand how to use it to build this bridge. Joining in is a way to connect, so you can learn their favourite scripts too. Some kids really hate this because they fear that you're going to go off script, and there's nothing worse than someone going off script. But other kids really enjoy that and get a real buzz out of the fact that you're joining in and you understand where they're coming from. You can shape it by slowly adding new words to the script, so you might add on a couple of words at the end and help grow their script. And one of the really important things to do, especially for kids who are using it as a form of communication, is to add to it. So if this is the way that they are communicating, you need to give them a really wide dictionary of things that they can use, so that in all of their experiences, all of the ways that they're feeling, all of the things they're trying to say, they have something that they can use to say it. So it's really tempting to let them watch the same episode over and over and over and over again. But in doing so, make sure you help them pick out other phrases and words and things that they can use, so that they've got more of a range of ways to express themselves when they need to in different situations. So I know I've gone over that last part very quickly, but you can see that perseveration, stimming, routines and echolalia are all by nature repetitive, but really not interchangeable terms, and very different in cause and function, and are sometimes a problem, not necessarily always, and definitely not by default dysfunctional behaviours. So I think now's a good time to jump over and see if there are any questions. Chastity, if you're there, do we have any?
Yes, one person wants to know, what recommendations do you have for accommodations to address the repetitive behaviors in school from elementary school to high school, especially when they can be viewed as behaviors that are distracting to their peers?
That's a fantastic question. It's a huge question, but it's a good question. And I think that with repetitive behaviours, school is an area in which they tend to be the most problematic, because things that are okay and acceptable to do at home, or not as much of a problem at home, then once you're in a classroom with 30 other kids, become incredibly distracting, not just to the student but to all the other students. And that's one of those criteria for when a behaviour moves from being functional into dysfunctional, and that's when you need to intervene and interact to try to support that behaviour in a different way. And I worded that really carefully because it really depends on which of the four behaviours it is, and how much of and the quality of the problem that it's causing. So obviously, if it's a stimming behaviour that's causing danger or harm to somebody, that is a completely different situation to a stimming behaviour that's just annoying or causing distractions. So it's probably a question that they can't answer in the space of this webinar, but if you want to email me afterwards, then I think I can give you a better explanation of that. But basically, what the key issue there is the assessment of whether that behaviour is causing a problem and who it's causing the problem for, and what the nature of that problem is, needs to be very thorough and done in every context in which the behaviour is happening, because it might change between environments and times of day and different classrooms and things like that. So that was a brief explanation, but I'm very mindful of how much time we've got left, and I can't really answer that question in this amount of time. But two things. One is the previous recordings for previous webinars are all available up on the Family Matters site. There are topics ranging from meltdowns to selective eating and lots of preparing for summer break and going back to school. Some of the resources around school and teaching and how to manage repetitive behaviours are available on snagglebox.com, which is my website. So if you go to snagglebox.com or email me at beckoakley@gmail.com or find me on Facebook, you'll find lots more resources there based around schools. I have resources on Teachers Pay Teachers as well to look at for supporting different autistic behaviours in the classroom. So are there any other questions, Chassie?
No, there's no other questions, Beck.
Okay, then I'm done. Thank you all for joining us. Please do contact me if you'd like to talk more about any of these. I hope that this has given you a good overview of repetitive behaviours in autism, and you've got a better understanding of how they are similar and how they are different, and some of the things that you can do to help when they become a problem.
Yes, thank you
Thanks a
again,
lot
Beck,
for
for
joining me.
giving us a wealth of information this morning.
Yep.
Thanks to all the participants for joining us this morning. You will be asked to complete a brief survey after exiting this webinar. Please assist us in better serving you in the future by completing those few questions. Look for details of upcoming webinars and trainings on our website at www.fmptic.org, and contact our office for any individual assistance you might need related to your child's educational issues. Have a good rest of your day.